Why it sucked to be a Vestal virgin in ancient Rome. Everyone knows ancient Rome was brutal. Gladiators dying in arenas, slaves being worked to death, emperors executing anyone who looked at them wrong. But here's one that nobody talks about: 6 young girls living in a palace in the heart of Rome, treated like goddesses, worshipped by the entire city, given more privileges than most Roman men could ever dream of. Sounds amazing, right? Except if you broke one rule, just one, they buried you alive. Welcome to life as a Vestal virgin, the most prestigious, most dangerous, and most suffocating religious role in all of ancient Rome. How you ended up here? You didn't apply for this. You were chosen. Every few years, when a vacancy opened up, the chief priest of Rome, the Pontifex Maximus, selected a new Vestal. He'd go through a list of eligible girls from noble Roman families. The requirements were strict. You had to be between 6 and 10 years old. Both your parents had to be alive and freeborn Roman citizens. You had to be physically perfect, no disabilities, no visible defects, no speech impediments. You had to come from a respectable family with no history of scandal. If you met these requirements and the Pontifex Maximus pointed at you and said the words, "I take you, amata," meaning beloved, that was it. You were chosen. Your family couldn't refuse. Refusing the selection of a Vestal was considered an offense against the gods themselves. You were taken from your family at somewhere between 6 and 10 years old. Just a child. Too young to understand what you were agreeing to. Too young to have any say in the matter. Your family was honored, of course. Having a daughter chosen as a Vestal was enormous social prestige. Your family would benefit from the connection for generations. But you were gone. Removed from your home. Separated from your parents and siblings. Taken to the house of the Vestals in the Roman Forum, where you would live for the next 30 years. 30 years. You'd be released from service in your late 30s or early 40s. By then, most of your childhood friends would be married with grown children. You'd have spent your entire youth and young adulthood in service to the goddess Vesta. Now, before you think 30 years doesn't sound that bad, let me tell you about the one rule that made every single day of those 30 years terrifying. The one rule that could get you buried alive. You had to remain a virgin. That's it. That's the rule. Don't have sex. Don't even come close to having sex. Don't give anyone reason to suspect you might have had sex. Simple enough, right? Except the punishment for breaking this rule wasn't execution. It wasn't exile. It wasn't even imprisonment. They buried you alive. Specifically, they'd put you in an underground chamber just large enough to lie down in. They'd give you a small amount of food, a lamp, and a little water, just enough that technically they hadn't killed you themselves, the gods had. Then they'd seal the chamber above you and leave. You'd die in the dark, alone, in a hole in the ground. Your lamp would eventually go out. Your food and water would run out. The air would get thin, and nobody was coming to help you. This happened. It wasn't just a theoretical punishment. Historical records document Vestals being buried alive, emperors attending the ceremonies, crowds watching the procession to the underground chamber. And the man involved, if they could identify him, he was beaten to death in public. But the punishment fell hardest on you. Now here's what makes this even more terrifying. You didn't actually have to have sex to be accused. You just had to be accused. Rome was a deeply political city. Vestals were powerful figures. If someone wanted to embarrass a political enemy, accusing his relative who was a Vestal of unchastity was an effective weapon. If the gods seemed angry, if Rome lost a battle or suffered a disaster, people looked for someone to blame. Vestals were convenient targets. The accusation alone could destroy you. Even if you were acquitted, the suspicion followed you forever. So for 30 years, you lived under this shadow. Every interaction with a man, every conversation, every glance in the wrong direction, any of it could be twisted into an accusation that ended with you sealed in an underground chamber. But living in constant fear of being buried alive was only part of what made this job terrible. Because the daily reality of being a Vestal was its own kind of suffocating. What your daily life actually looked like. You're a Vestal virgin. Let me walk you through what your days actually look like. You wake up early. Your primary duty is tending the sacred flame of Vesta, the goddess of the hearth. This flame could never go out, ever. The Romans believed that if the flame died, disaster would befall Rome. Enemies would invade. The gods would abandon the city. So you and the other Vestals maintained the flame in rotating shifts, day and night, every single day of the year. If it was your shift, you were responsible for that flame. If it went out on your watch, you were flogged. Not gently. Flogged by the Pontifex Maximus himself in a dark room. Beyond the flame, you had ritual duties throughout the year. Sacred ceremonies, religious festivals, preparing sacred foods used in Roman religious rituals, maintaining the sacred objects kept in the Temple of Vesta, including the Palladium, a sacred statue believed to protect Rome itself. You also served as witnesses and keepers of important documents. Wills and treaties were kept in the house of the Vestals, because Vestals were considered absolutely trustworthy and their property was sacred and inviolable. Your schedule was rigid. Your duties were prescribed. Your movements were controlled. You couldn't just go anywhere in Rome. When you moved through the city, you traveled in a special covered carriage. Lictors, official Roman attendants, went before you clearing the way. Citizens had to step aside for you. Even senators gave way. This sounds like power, and in some ways it was. But it was also surveillance. You were always accompanied, always watched, always visible. You had no private life, no anonymous moments, no ability to move through the world like a normal person. And your personal life? What personal life? You couldn't marry during your 30 years of service. You couldn't have relationships. You couldn't pursue your own interests or desires. Your entire identity was Vestal virgin. Nothing else was permitted. You lived in the house of the Vestals, a large, comfortable complex in the Roman Forum. You had decent rooms, good food, servants to attend you. By Roman standards, the physical conditions were excellent, but you were trapped in those excellent conditions. Comfortable captivity is still captivity. And here's something most people don't think about: what happens to you emotionally when you're taken from your family at age 6 and raised in an institution for 30 years. The psychological cost nobody talks about. You were taken from your parents at 6 years old. You were separated from your siblings, your friends, everything familiar. You were raised by the other Vestals and the institution of the priesthood. Your entire social world was the house of the Vestals and official Roman religious life. You didn't have a normal childhood. You didn't play with neighborhood children, or have sleepovers, or experience the ordinary chaos of growing up in a Roman family. You were trained from childhood to suppress normal human desires. Trained to deny yourself relationships, affection, physical intimacy. Trained to see your body as a sacred object belonging to Rome rather than as yourself. By the time you were old enough to understand what you'd given up, you'd already spent years being shaped into someone who couldn't want those things, or at least couldn't admit to wanting them. Some Vestals probably genuinely found meaning and satisfaction in their role. The power was real. The prestige was real. The religious significance was real. If you believed deeply in what you were doing, 30 years of service might feel purposeful, but others must have struggled, must have looked out from their carriages at ordinary Roman women walking with their husbands, playing with their children, living lives that would never be available to you. You'd watch girls you knew get married and start families. You'd be invited to their weddings as an honored guest, a prestigious Vestal, while inside you'd know that you'd never have that. Never hold your own baby. Never build a life with someone you loved. Some Vestals cracked under this pressure. Historical records describe Vestals who were accused of breaking their vows. Some were probably guilty, driven by loneliness or desire after years of forced celibacy. Others were almost certainly innocent, victims of political machinations. Either way, the penalty was the same: the underground chamber, the sealed door, the darkness. And even if you never broke your vows, even if you served faithfully for 30 years, freedom at the end came with its own problems. What happened when it was finally over? After 30 years of service, you were released, free to leave the house of the Vestals, free to marry if you wanted, free to live a normal life. Except you were in your late 30s or early 40s. In ancient Rome, women typically married in their early to mid-teens. By the time you were free, you were considered old by Roman standards. Most men weren't interested in marrying an older woman, even a former Vestal with significant prestige and financial benefits. Some former Vestals did marry, but it wasn't easy, and many didn't. More importantly, you'd spent 30 years in an institution. You didn't know how to live independently. You'd never managed your own household, never navigated ordinary Roman social life as an adult woman, never built the personal relationships and family networks that most Romans relied on. You were famous but disconnected, prestigious but isolated, free but unprepared for freedom. Some former Vestals apparently struggled terribly after their service ended. The structure that had defined their entire lives was suddenly gone. The identity they'd built around being a Vestal had no meaning outside the role. Roman writers noted that former Vestals who married often had unhappy marriages, that they struggled to adjust to ordinary life, that the transition from sacred virgin to regular Roman woman was harder than anyone expected. You'd given 30 years to Rome. Rome gave you back your freedom when you were too old and too institutionalized to fully use it. The privilege was real, so was the prison. Here's the complicated truth about being a Vestal virgin: the privileges were genuine. The power was real. You could free condemned prisoners just by chance encounter on the way to execution. Your testimony in court carried more weight than almost anyone else's. You had the best seats at the gladiatorial games. You were invited to all the most important state occasions. Emperors treated you with respect. The entire city honored you. When you died and were buried, you were one of the only women in Rome allowed to be buried within the city limits. But you'd been taken from your family at 6 years old without your consent. You'd spent 30 years under the threat of being buried alive if you broke your vow. You'd suppressed every natural human desire for connection and intimacy in service to a flame and a goddess. You'd been watched and controlled and managed for 3 decades. The privileges existed inside a cage. A beautiful, comfortable, prestigious cage. But a cage nonetheless. At 6 years old, you had no idea what you were agreeing to. By the time you were old enough to understand, it was already too late. You were already shaped into the role, already living under the shadow of what would happen if you ever stepped outside the boundaries. Being a Vestal virgin in ancient Rome meant being simultaneously the most honored and the most controlled woman in the city. It meant giving your entire youth to a role you were selected for as a child. It meant living every day with the knowledge that one mistake, one accusation, one moment of human weakness would end with you sealed underground in the dark. The flame of Vesta never went out, and neither did the fear. Tell me what scared you the most about being a Vestal virgin in ancient Rome.